The gentleman from South Carolina, the chairman of the Immigration and Border Security Subcommittee, Mr. Gowdy, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Mr. Attorney General.
Good afternoon.
Do you think it's reasonable to evaluate how effectively prosecutors and law enforcement are using current firearm statutes as we debate whether or not we need additional firearm statutes?
Sure, that ought to be a factor, but I think we are using the laws effectively.
Well, I would have to take your word for it for this reason. I wrote you 6 months ago and asked for statistics specifically on two code sections, 922D and 922G, which deal, as you know, specifically with the possession or transfer of firearms by those who have been adjudicated mentally defective or committed to mental institutions. I wrote that letter in December, thinking that being a low-level House member wasn't enough to garner any attention. I then got a senator to co-sign the exact same letter with me, and we have not heard back yet. So you agree that it is relevant how effectively those code sections are being prosecuted as we evaluate whether or not we need additional tools?
Excuse me. I think that we should take into account all of what we're doing in terms of weapons prosecutions. 1/7 of all the cases that we bring in the federal system are gun cases.
What percentage of current background check failures are prosecuted?
A much smaller number. There were 83,000 background check failures in fiscal year 2012. There were 85,000 cases brought. Much smaller number of those failures were actually brought. The purpose of the background check system, though, is to prevent people from acquiring guns. 1.5 million have been stopped since the beginning of the system, as opposed to the prosecution. And that's why I understand numbers.
I understand that, Mr. Attorney General. I also understand a little something about a lack of jury appeal. I know certain cases don't have tremendous jury appeal, but when you're advocating for increased background checks, and it can be argued that you're not a good steward of the current background check laws that you have, I just frankly think it undercuts the argument. But reasonable minds can differ on that, I suppose. I don't think reasonable minds can differ on 922D and 922G, which deal with people, these are not my words, it's in the statute, been adjudged mentally defective or committed to a mental institution. If you want to search for a theme throughout lots of our mass killings, I think we'll find that theme. I want to read to you a quote that's been attributed to you. If the quote is inaccurate, I want to give you a chance to tell me it's inaccurate. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but creating a pathway to earn citizenship for the 11 million unauthorized immigrants in this country is essential. This is a matter of civil and human rights. Is that an accurate quote?
Yeah, I think that's a speech I gave at the Anti-Defamation League.
All right. Well, you would agree with me that persons who can't pass background checks should not have the civil right, as you call it, of citizenship.
Well, as I use that phrase, I didn't use it in the strictly legal sense.
But Mr. Attorney General, with all due respect, that's the problem with using the phrase. Well, that's the problem. I mean, you are a highly trained lawyer, and you know what the phrase civil right means. And when you say that you have a civil right to citizenship, when you have broken the law to come to the country, that comment has consequences, and surely you have to know that.
With all due respect, it was my speech, and those were the words that I chose. And I did not mean to convey, and I didn't think that it would be taken that way. Some have said that, many have not, that meant that there was a legal right or anything like that. It was in the context of that phrase where I said civil and I think human right. I think that's the word that I used there.
Right, but you can understand how it's problematic for those of us, frankly, who are working on immigration reform and don't come from districts where it's a really popular political idea, to have the Attorney General say you have a civil and human right to citizenship even though you're in the country in violation of our laws. That's a non sequitur, and it's hard for some of us to explain that. So I don't know what you meant. I just know what you said.
Yeah, and what I meant was that you've got 11 million undocumented people here who are, we must admit, contributing to this country in substantial ways, who oftentimes are exploited because they are in that undocumented status.
But,
And we
Mr.
have to
Attorney
deal
General,
with
my point is all 11 million aren't valedictorians, which is why every bill has a background check provision. And all 11 million don't want citizenship. So to call it a human and civil right, speaking for a broad group of 11 million, I'm just, with all due respect, it's just not helpful to those of us who are trying to be part of the conversation.
Sure.
But
And I didn't mean to say by that all 11 million either want to be citizens, you're right, or will ultimately, as the bills have been crafted, and I think appropriately so, will pass the necessary background checks. But I'm talking about the universe of people who we do have, which is generally accepted as 11 million. And from that 11 million, and I suspect it's going to be a large portion of that 11 million, will pass background checks, will desire to become citizens, and then will be entitled to the human rights that all Americans have, after they go through that period that allows them to acquire citizenship along that pathway.
I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman.
The Chair thanks the gentleman and now recognizes the gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Labrador, for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Mr. Attorney General. One of your favorite phrases during this hearing and in many other hearings where I've heard you is ongoing criminal investigations. I also have heard you several times talk about best practices and proprieties. When you decided to recuse yourself, did you look at best practice? I think you admitted already that it would have been probably a better practice for you to put in writing, but there's already a statute, 28 U.S.C. Section 591, that requires to put in writing your reasons for recusal in certain circumstances. Frankly, I've read it a couple times. I don't know if it applies to your situation right now, but don't you think it would have been the best practice for you to just put it in writing, especially when you're talking about an issue of such significance?
Well, as I said, as I've thought about it even during the course of this last couple of hours, that I think that, I'm going to go back and actually think about whether or not there's some kind of policy that I should put in place. Examine how often it's happened, recusals have happened in writing as opposed to orally, and I think that the better practice, as I said, frankly, I think is that we probably ought to put them in.
And I think you should look at whether 28 U.S.C. 591, again, I don't know that it applies to you, but you should really look at whether that applies to you or not, or whether there's any other law that would have required you to.
There are 2 things I have on my to-do list here.
Okay. The second thing I want to talk about is we already discussed the targeting by the IRS, admitting that they targeted conservative groups. Will you state today under oath that the Department of Justice, under your watch, has not targeted conservative groups for prosecution for political reasons or to gain political advantage?
It's not to my knowledge. I have no knowledge that has ever occurred.
Do you know if the IRS leaked tax information related to Mitt Romney during the Republican presidential primary or general campaign?
I don't know.
And if you do not know, will you attempt to find out in your investigation?
I'm not sure that I'm not sure I have a predicate for that. I'll be honest with you. I don't remember that.
There were several claims during the campaign that there was personal information for Mitt Romney's tax records that were being leaked to the press, and I just want to know if the IRS was the one leaking that information. We also know that some of Mitt Romney's top donors were targeted by the IRS and the Labor Department, including a gentleman from Idaho. So if you could look at that as well, why it was that specifically people who were giving money, who were some of Romney's top campaign donors, that were actually immediately after they became public about how much money they had donated, that all of a sudden the IRS and the Labor Department was looking at them. And I have an important question. We've heard about numerous groups that were targeted that were conservative groups. Can you tell me whether Obama for America, Organizing for America, Occupy Wall Street, or any other progressive group has been targeted in the last 3 to 4 years by the IRS?
Well, we're at the beginning of the investigation, so I don't know what of any groups were targeted. All I know is what I've read about in the press. I'm not in a position to say, on the basis of the beginning stages of this investigation, which groups might have been inappropriately looked at.
Can you find out if it was only conservative? Because I think this is important. I think it's rather strange that it's only one group, a political group, but not the other kind of political group. Can you find out for our committee whether that?
Oh, I mean, the investigation would be designed to find out which groups were looked at, make sure that if they were looked at, it was done on an appropriate basis. If it was inappropriate, then to hold people accountable. And that will be done regardless of whether or not they are conservative or liberal, Republican-leaning, or Democratic-leaning.
And if you find out that they were only conservative, can you find out why it was that only conservative groups were targeted?
Yeah,
now, as you were, I'm going to read to you a quote that you stated about your contempt of Congress from last year. In February of this year, you said, "I have to tell you that for me to really be affected by what happened, meaning the contempt of Congress, I have to have respect for the people who voted in that way. And I didn't, so it didn't have that huge impact on me." Don't you think that quote shows contempt for the Republican members of Congress that are here that voted for this? And there were actually some Democratic members of Congress who also voted for contempt.
Well, I have to say that the process that we went through, or that you all went through, in making that contempt determination seemed inconsistent with both prior practice and also inconsistent with, or not taking into account, the good faith attempts that we were making to try to share the information that was sought. And I also thought that it was telling that when the NRA decided to score that vote, what was the NRA? What was the involvement of the NRA in that vote at all? It seemed to me then that this was something that was not about me, not about, well, it was about me, but was not about, it was about things beyond just the exchange of documents. It was an attempt by certain people to get at this Attorney General. And that's why I said that with regard to that process, I simply didn't and don't have respect for it.
But you say you didn't have respect for the people who voted, and I think that same contempt may have led also to people in this administration thinking that they can go after conservatives and conservative groups. Thank you. I yield back.
I'm not the cause of people in the IRS